at number 10 is Dan Cooper. Back in 1971, a man who went by the alias Dan Cooper hijacked a commercial plane, and no one has ever been able to find him since. According to those involved, shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant claiming to have a his briefcase. He demanded 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills, which is the equivalent of like $1.2 million nowadays. Otherwise, he was going to kill everyone on the plane. After the flight landed in Seattle, Cooper released the 36 passengers once authorities had provided him with the money and parachutes, but kept both pilots, 1 flight engineer, and flight attendants as hostages on the plane. From there, he forced them to fly to Mexico City, but somewhere over Nevada, Cooper jumped off the plane with the stolen cash. The FBI launched a massive search that is still considered one of the longest and most exhaustive investigations in FBI history. But Dan Cooper has yet to be found, and I'm sure many agents lost sleep over trying to figure out this case. Moving on to number 9, Jose Rodolfo Varela Hernandez. Also sometimes referred to as El Gato, this criminal was one of the newer additions to the FBI's most wanted list, having been added just 3 years ago in 2020. But he is definitely a terrifying man. A warrant for his arrest was issued back in June of 2018 when El Gato was accused of having involvement with interstate stalking and as well as hiring 2 men to assassinate a man named Guerrero back in 2013. Allegedly, the 2 hired men tracked down Guerrero and his wife and attempted to take them down. Guerrero did not make it past the attack, but luckily his wife escaped unharmed. The craziest part of all of this is that allegedly Guerrero's sister, after the attack, took revenge on El Gato by having one of his relatives beheaded, which to me sounds like they might have pissed off the wrong people. For a while, the FBI wasn't exactly sure where El Gato was hiding, but thankfully as of January of this year, he was finally found in Mexico and put into custody. That being said, it doesn't make his case any less disturbing. Moving on to number 8. Glendon Scott Crawford. In 2012, Glendon Scott Crawford, who was a part of the Pointy Hat white supremacist group, conspired with a guy named Eric Fate to turn an industrial-grade X-ray radiation device into a weapon of mass destruction. The plan was to have a remote-controlled death ray he could use on Muslims in the United States, targeting mosques, community centers, and so on. So Crawford sought assistance from Chris Barker, one of the Imperial Wizards in his hate group. However, what Crawford did not know was that Barker, in an effort to handle his own felony charges, had become an informant for the FBI. This led to another FBI agent coming on the case undercover, and eventually, once there was enough evidence stacked against Crawford's plan to commit acts of he was sentenced to 30 years behind bars. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for those undercover agents to be in the same room with such a disgusting man. Next up at number 7, Arnaldo Jimenez. Most people have a romantic honeymoon, at least that is sort of the assumption, but Mr. Arnaldo Jimenez here seemed to have a different plan in mind. Back in 2012, the day after marrying his wife, who, to make matters worse, he already had a family with, Jimenez took her out with some friends to a club. Apparently the couple left around 4 a.m. from the club, and from there, for whatever reason, he took her life. His wife was stabbed to death in the back of his car before being dragged into the bathroom tub of her apartment and abandoned. Obviously, this creep was charged and a warrant went out for his arrest, and although authorities have reason to believe he may have fled back to Mexico, they haven't actually been able to track him down. To this day, he remains on the FBI's most wanted with a $250,000 reward for his capture. Coming in at number 6, Daniela Green. Born in Germany, Daniela moved to the US with her family before she was hired as a contract linguist for the FBI in 2011. While working at the FBI, they made use of her bilingual skills and ended up assigning her to a German terror criminal known as Individual A at the time. Through research, Green discovered her subject was a former rap artist named Dennis Kuisbert, who had joined, that group, and over time, Green found ways to correspond with Kuisbert. However, in a shocking turn of events, their relationship turned romantic. Soon Green made secretive plans to fly out to Syria and meet him, and within hours of her arrival, the two got married. But it didn't take long before she realized what a mess she found herself in and ended up emailing an acquaintance for help. Within 5 weeks, American authorities caught up to her. Green was arrested and returned to the US, but was released after only 9 months in jail, and the FBI spun her involvement with Cuthbert as that of an unsuspecting linguist duped by a conniving criminal. Still, I can only imagine how disturbing it must have been for everyone involved, knowing that one of their own had double-crossed them and married the literal enemy they were trying to take down. Coming in at number 5, Scott Armstrong. In the early to mid 2000s, Scott Armstrong was a special FBI agent who had recently become a member of the Cyber Crimes Task Force at the Boone County Sheriff's Department, and he had a very important job to do there: to protect vulnerable members of society from illicit photography. So you can imagine other FBI agents' shock when Armstrong soon found himself in an arraignment for third-degree assault on one of these vulnerable members who it was his job to protect. According to the Callaway County Police Department, the incident occurred at Armstrong's residence at around midnight on March 1st, 2014. And Armstrong was accused of putting a boy in a chokehold that ended up with him losing consciousness. The boy's parents later took photos of their son's neck, which had signs of being choked, including redness and fabric patterns. While Armstrong pleaded not guilty to the accusation, he admitted he'd placed his arm around the victim's neck until he passed out, which, I mean, to me sounds like the same thing. However, what was never explained in the report is why the boy was at Armstrong's residence in the first place. And even worse, Armstrong was only sentenced to 1 year probation, mandated to complete 25 hours of community service, and fined $325.39. Moving on to number 4. Albert Fish. Also known as the Brooklyn Vampire, Albert Fish was a terrifying killer responsible for the death of 3 people in the mid-1920s, although according to him, it was well over 100. Fish grew up in an unstable home. Both his parents suffered from mental illness, and after his father died, he was sent to live at an orphanage. While there, he was by the other orphans, but he started to develop a rather confusing feeling towards the pain. He began to enjoy it. As Fish got older, he started seeking darker and more twisted things to feel alive, and soon that led to the kidnapping, taking advantage of, killing, and later devouring of minors. Thankfully, the monster was caught in 1935, and shockingly, he wasted no time denying his atrocities. In fact, he almost seemed proud of them. I can't, and frankly won't, go into detail about what he did, but it is some of the most disgusting stuff I have ever read about. And I can only imagine the agents on his case felt the same. Eventually, Fish was sentenced to death and died by electric chair in 1936. After his death, his lawyer refused to release his final statement, saying, quote, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." Coming in at number 3. Gary Ridgway. Another disturbing case for the FBI. Gary grew up in a troubled household with very little stability, which led to him wetting his bed well into his teen years. After each incident, his mother would clean him up, which led Gary to have conflicting feelings of both anger and desire towards his mother, often fantasizing about killing her and doing awful things to her. When he got older, he joined the military, and although he was married, he started to become obsessed with escorts. But once he returned back to America, his marriage ended quickly after his wife discovered he had given her multiple infections. Soon he married again, however, this time finding salvation in the church. He forced his wife into a staunch and devout life, but in contrast, kept his ravenous appetite for inappropriate relations, both with his wife and with those whose company he paid for. But Ridgway had an inner conflict about his desires, and started strangling the women after he had got what he wanted, then dumped their brutalized bodies into the woods. Disgustingly, it was later revealed by one of his wives that he would often ask to have relations in the woods. At the time, she didn't know why, but during investigations, multiple of his victims were found in those woods, and authorities believe he got pleasure from being in the area. Upon his arrest, he was officially convicted for taking 49 lives, but during trial, he famously said he had killed so many that he lost count, and that even he didn't know the real number anymore. Thankfully, the monster was sentenced to life in prison, but I can imagine it's one of the creepier cases agents have had to deal with. Moving on to number 2. Mark Putnam. In the mid-1980s, Mark Putnam was a happy husband, father, and successful FBI agent. But after relocating to the Bureau's Pikeville office, things began to change. At this time, Carl Edwards Lockhart, a notorious bank robber, had just been let out of prison, and Putnam believed that he was back to his old ways. So he began gathering informants that could help him take down Lockhart. One of these informants was Susan Smith, addicted divorcee raising a family who needed the cash. But soon, she became more than just Putnam's informant. The two began an affair, and by 1989, Smith was allegedly pregnant. This terrified Putnam. He knew it would not only ruin his marriage, but end his career, and so he demanded a paternity test and explained he and his wife could adopt from her. This, however, led to a violent fight between them that ultimately ended with Putnam strangling Susan to death. Initially, the suspect was Susan's ex-husband, but soon Putnam was interrogated, and after failing a polygraph, he confessed to the whole thing and offered to lead the FBI to where she was. However, there are a few mysteries. Susan Smith's sister claimed that FBI agent Ron Poole, Putnam's superior, not only knew about Smith's alleged pregnancy, but also disclosed to Smith information about Putnam's illicit activities with other informants. And allegedly, medical examiners claimed that they were unable to find any trace of a fetus during an autopsy on Smith, who should have been 4 months pregnant. I mean, it's just all disturbing top to bottom. And last up in our number 1 spot, Mississippi burning. In 1964, during the Freedom Summer in America, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were working to register black voters in what was at the time a deeply segregated and racially hostile state, overrun with members of the evil pointy hat community. But during their campaign, the men were arrested for speeding. They were detained for a few hours, but eventually released. However, before leaving the county, their car was again pulled over, and the 3 men were abducted, driven to another location, and shot dead. Initially a missing persons case, the FBI was called in to investigate the disappearance of these men, but sadly after 7 weeks of searching, their bodies were discovered buried in a ditch. During the investigation, it emerged that members of the local white racist group, the Neshoba County Sheriff's Office, and the Philadelphia Police Department were involved in the incident. It was a truly disgusting and outrageous case filled with corruption and evil. But outrage over the activist's disappearance helped gain passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. First up in our number 10 spot is Edmund Kemper. One of the most notorious killers of the 20th century, Kemper was actually one of the first killers to help the FBI figure out the patterns of repeat killers. But I mean, the help he provided was disturbing, to say the least. It started with torturing insects, then by the age of 10 he buried his pet cat alive, waited for it to die, then dug it up, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a spike. From there, things got more concerning. By the age of 13, his parents divorced and his mother became his sole parental figure. However, she was an abusive alcoholic who mocked and humiliated him, and so their relationship turned into an extremely toxic one. At 14, Kemper ran away from home to try and be with his father, but eventually ended up living with his grandparents, and that is where things got really bad. At 15, he killed both his grandparents and was arrested for the crime. However, due to his age, he didn't face any criminal charges. By 1969, on his 21st birthday, he was released on parole against his psychologist's warning and sent to live with his mother. mother. By 1972, he began seeking out college student victims after fights with his mother, and by 1973, he had taken the lives of 8 different women this way, becoming known in the public as the co-ed killer. Finally, in April of 1973, he took his mother's life, the one he always wanted to, and did unspeakable things to her corpse before turning himself in. In the end, Kemper was sentenced to life in prison, despite his request to be tortured to death, and will remain behind bars until his final days. Moving on to number 9, the West Mesa bone collector. Back in 2009, a woman on a leisurely walk with her dog came across something peculiar. A human bone. Little did she know, she'd stumbled upon a major crime scene. Upon her discovery, authorities became immediately involved and discovered that it was a mass grave filled with human remains. But how did they get there? A killer dubbed the West Mesa bone collector. Active between 2001 to 2005, the killer was known to target young women, usually Hispanic, and almost always involved in late night services or the trade, but not exclusively, which made it hard to identify why he chose his victims. While we know practically nothing about the killer, we do know that he would take the bodies to the desert to dispose of them. After years of police investigation, the remains of 11 women were found scattered in the deserts of Albuquerque, but the exact way they died is yet to be discovered, as medical examiners and forensic experts have not been able to identify his methods, which is very unusual. Sadly, neither police or FBI have ever been able to track down who was responsible for ending these young women's lives, and I am sure the agents on the case are continually disturbed by the fact that he remains on the loose. Moving on to number 8, Alejandro Castillo. 6 years ago, Alejandro Castillo texted his coworker Sandy Lee, who he had briefly dated prior, saying that he wanted to repay her the money she had loaned him. So, under the guise of getting her money back, Lee agreed to meet up with him. But here's where it gets twisty. Castillo had a new girlfriend at the time, named Amia Feaster, and the afternoon of the incident, he was picked up by her and she drove the pair to meet up with Lee. Although the full details of the crime aren't confirmed, it's believed Castillo, instead of giving Lee her money back, held her at gunpoint while forcing her to withdraw all the money she had from a nearby ATM, which was about $1,000. Investigators think Castillo then drove Lee into the woods and took her life before dumping the body into a ravine. From there, Castillo and his current girlfriend Feaster fled in his Toyota Corolla to Mexico. Since then, he hasn't been seen, but his girlfriend turned herself in 2016, confirming they had been living with Castillo's cousins when they were in hiding. The FBI hasn't been able to track him down just yet, but they do think he remains hiding in Mexico to this day. Moving on to number 7, Richard Trenton Chase. Often referred to as the Vampire of Sacramento, Chase was a truly terrifying killer who took the life of 6 people in just 1 month back in 1977. Before he turned to human victims, Chase would capture animals and bring them back to his apartment to kill and disembowel. From there, he would eat them raw, sometimes mixing them with Coca-Cola in his blender. Then in 1973, Chase was forcibly admitted to an institution after being taken to emergency for trying to inject rabbit's blood into his veins. While in the facility, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and became known as the Vampire, as he all too often killed animals and drank their blood. But by 1976, he was deemed no longer a threat to society and released back into his mother's custody. Tragically, she began weaning him off his medication, believing he didn't really need it, and once again, he slipped into old habits. But this time, it wasn't birds and rabbits Chase was harming. He was breaking into homes and killing people before treating them just as he did his animals. Eventually, he was put on trial for his 6 victims, and a jury ruled him guilty, rejecting the defense's attempt that he could not be tried due to insanity. Chase was sentenced to death, but ended up taking his own life while behind bars before his execution. Next up at number 6, Adolf Kurz III. On February 9th, 1960, a milkman sounded his horn several times in an attempt to get the attention of a station wagon that was blocking the middle of a bridge. But when there was no response, he got out of his truck and walked to the vehicle, but it was empty. This was strange, he thought, since its engine was running and the radio was playing, so after moving the car himself, he reported the matter to local police, who quickly determined that the car belonged to Adolf Coors III, heir to the Coors Brewing Company fortune. Coors had left his house not far from the bridge that morning, but had not been seen since. 24 hours into the investigation, the FBI entered the case, and good thing too, because that afternoon, Coors' wife Mary received a note demanding ransom for the return of her husband. The investigation continued with nearly 23 agents on the case, but sadly, despite payment, his body was found on September 11, 1960 in a remote area in Douglas County, Colorado. The man responsible was Joseph Corbett Jr., who had fled to Canada, but was eventually caught and sentenced to prison, where he ultimately died. Next up at number 5, Robert Hansen. Known in the media as the Butcher Baker, Hansen was an extremely sick killer who quite literally viewed his victims as prey. In his adolescence, Robert was an awkward and shy boy who had absolutely no luck with girls. These early rejections festered into a deep hatred for women, for which he later would seek revenge. As he got older, he began finding solace in archery and hunting, and would routinely spend his time perfecting his craft alone in the woods. Then in the early 1960s, he began seeking revenge, at first by committing arson on his high school property, but then soon turned to seek revenge on women specifically. By 1971, he was kidnapping and taking advantage of women, but not yet killing. He was charged and sentenced to 5 years for his crimes, but after just 6 months was released on a work program. After his release is where it really got scary. He began kidnapping women and escorts, taking them back to his apartment where he would do awful things to their bodies, before flying them out to secluded areas in the wilderness and telling them he was going to hunt them down and kill them. Tragically, an estimated 21 women lost their lives to this monster, but thankfully he was convicted and sentenced to 461 years in prison without possibility of parole. Moving on to number 4, Patty Hearst. Referred to by the FBI as the strangest case in their history, Patty Hearst was an heiress to the Hearst publishing fortune. In 1974, at 19 years old, she was kidnapped from her apartment she shared with her fiancé by a group called the Symbionese Liberation Army. Now, the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, was the first left-wing terror group in the USA, and they chose Patty to leverage the Hearst family's political influence to free 2 SLA members who had been arrested in 1973. In the subsequent 19 months, Hearst was severely harmed, but began to align with the SLA, participating in their crimes, including making weapons and a bank robbery, and was eventually arrested with other members of the SLA and charged with the crimes she participated in. Upon her arrest, Hearst shared the horrors that had happened to her while a prisoner, claiming to have been a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. But despite the controversial circumstances, she was convicted of bank robbery and sentenced to prison. That being said, in 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence to time served, and in 2001, she was pardoned by President Bill Clinton. Next up at number 3, Michael James Pratt. Currently on the FBI's top 10 most wanted, I can only imagine how disturbed the FBI was when they first became aware of this case. Between approximately 2012 to 2019, Michael Pratt, along with a few accomplices, was involved in recruiting underage girls to be a part of an adult film production company that he owned and operated. Pratt lured the girls in under Craigslist ads asking for models, and from there he promised payment in exchange for a clothed modeling gig. But sadly, this couldn't have been further from what he had planned for the victims. Beyond the obviously morally despicable stuff they were making these girls do, he would also force past victims into providing false assurance to the girls that their films would never end up online. Allegedly, some of the victims were not permitted to leave until the shoot was completed, others were forced to perform after declining participation, and the crew was also known to commit SA when the girls wouldn't comply. After fleeing the country in 2019, right before his trial for his crimes, he was added to the FBI list, and the search for this creep continues. Coming in at number 2, Rodney Alcala. During the late 70s, Rodney came into the public eye after appearing on the TV show The Dating Game, but what America didn't know yet was that he was was actually a cold-blooded killer. It's kind of wild that he managed to get on the show in the first place because he already had a pretty hefty criminal history, having already been one of America's most wanted fugitives for several kidnappings of girls, as well as a few suspected killings, but I guess they just didn't do much of a background check on the contestants. At the time, fellow contestants thought he was very strange and creepy, but still he won the competition and a date with the Bachelorette. However, she too felt something was wrong with him and refused to go on a date, which authorities believe was what might have thrown Rodney over the edge. He began kidnapping at a much higher rate, inviting unsuspecting girls and boys to his house to model for him. Once he got them to his house, he would take them into his photo room and force them to take photos before taking advantage of them and ending their lives. Finally, authorities caught on to him, and upon his 1979 arrest, police uncovered more than 1,000 photographs linking him to a suspected 130 victims. Officially, he was convicted for 8 killings and sentenced to death, but died of natural causes before the day came. And last up in our number 1 spot, the Breonna Dennison case. Breonna Dennison was a college student home for the holidays in Reno, Nevada, when tragically one night she went missing while staying over at a friend's house. In the days following, the Reno Police Department conducted an investigation at her friend's home where she had last been seen and concluded she had been abducted after discovering male DNA on a doorknob and her own on a pillowcase. At this point, the FBI became involved in the search, and after investigations linked the male DNA to other open cases involving sexually violent crimes, they worried that the missing girl's fate had already been decided. And sadly, nearly a month after she had gone missing, Breonna was found dead in a ditch. That fall, after lengthy investigations, interrogations, and DNA samples, they finally found the man guilty of the crime, James Biella. And it came out that he had actually held her captive in his home for several days, harming and doing awful things to her body before he eventually killed her. And to top it off, he lived 1 block from FBI agents, 2 sheriffs, and a local police officer. So he was literally doing it all under their nose.